Hello, Barry.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm fine. Today's discussion was motivated in part by the fact that I keep getting confused by the different articles about our unsustainable national debt. They go back and forth between using the debt owned by the public or owed by the public to the public and the gross debt. And so perhaps we should clarify that to our viewers. Uh, the gross debt is sneaking up on 36 trillion. Here in late June 2024, it's a little bit over 35 trillion, which is a mind-boggling number. But the important thing about a number like that, and the debt owed to the public is at 27 trillion. The two important parts about that are one, the size in relation to the economy. Both of those debt numbers are bigger than our economy, because our economy is at about $26 trillion. And the other important number is the likely interest payments, which the interest rate is currently hovering around 5%. Most people believe the interest rate, at least on the debt, if not regular interest rates, will go higher because of increased risk of the debt and plus the increased borrowing pressure. And at about 5%, you don't have to be a math whiz to understand that will cost us about 5% of 35 trillion is 1.7 trillion. Okay, so how do you put that number in perspective? That's a third of our federal revenue. Yeah. You wonder why admirals and generals are saying that the national debt is a major security threat. We're crowding out other spending by having to pay more and more interest.
Yeah, the number that shocked me at this point, this latest study of debt by the Congressional Budget Office is pretty grim. Every citizen now owes $100,000 in public debt, every single citizen. And essentially, what that most recent study shows is that this debt is growing at a rate that's pushing us very close to what we call the fiscal cliff. That is the point where people lose confidence in the ability of our country to repay the debt. So I think we're reaching the final years of the debt crisis because it can't go on forever, right?
It's definitely unsustainable. And the important thing to understand about it, the fiscal cliff, I would have to say the vast, vast majority of Americans that don't even realize what kind of trouble we're in, is that we're going to have to do some combination of three really unpleasant, painful things, namely raise taxes. And there's a question in many people's mind about which taxes will actually produce much additional revenue and at what painful cost to our economy. So that's an important subject for us here at the Institute for Objective Policy Assessment to be studying which taxes are actually likely to produce much additional revenue, and whether it's through a tax increase or decrease that additional revenue is likely to be realized. And the second thing that's likely or a dangerous thing when we're at the fiscal cliff is the possibility that the Federal Reserve will print money in order to keep the federal government from defaulting on the debt. And if the inflation rate gets high enough, hyperinflation, close to that, supply chains will break down. So there's no way to defend against that. You can buy all the gold in the world that you want to hedge against inflation and do other things. And if the supply chains break down because the prices that you can charge are so uncertain, we're all going to be in deep trouble because we're all dependent on each other through our complicated economy. And then the other possibility, of course, is spending cuts. And as you know, no politician likes to even discuss them, especially anything specific that your next election opponent can use against you. So, we're in an the emperor has no clothes kind of a situation for those who remember that fairy tale, that fable. Nobody wants to point out that we need to cut a lot of things, and we need to be prepared to cut them so we don't do it haphazardly in a frenzied situation. So we need to get ready for possibly going over the fiscal cliff. Hopefully we can still prevent that, but we need to be ready so we won't get ourselves in a number of problems, financial problems, the world losing confidence in the dollar, and then difficulty defending ourselves because nobody will lend us money unfavorable terms in a national emergency.
Yeah, the thing that strikes me, John, is that we've given up what used to be called the good old fiscal religion of balanced budgets, and for centuries in this country, it was accepted that the federal government should balance its budget, and I think the idea was that we might have emergencies, a war, and in every war, of course, we do incur deficits and accumulate debt. But for centuries, the idea was that when you then have a peacetime, you generate surpluses and repay that debt. And I think this old concept of balancing the budget in the long term really continued well into the after the period after the Second World War. Even President Truman and Eisenhower both talked about how we had military spending, but we had to then offset that with surplus revenue so we could balance our budget. So, and I think the other thing that I think has really created a major problem for us is redefining emergency. It used to be the emergency was a military conflict that required massive spending, but now they define emergencies to cover just about anything. And of course, a lot of the things that are non-emergency things are shoveled into this military emergency category so they can spend it. And so I think that when you say cutting spending, I think one of the first things we need to rethink is emergency spending, because we've basically defined it to cover just about anything at this point. And so now what we do whenever we have a crisis, like the COVID or the financial crisis in 2009, we incur the deficits. And then, of course, after that's over, we continue to incur deficits. So now we have permanent deficits, permanent debt accumulation, and we've rejected the whole idea of balancing our budget in the long term.
Yeah, a lot of people react to this with really simplistic things, thinking, hey, it's easy, just cut spending and raise taxes. But neither of those are nearly simple, because as I mentioned a minute ago, there's no guarantee that increasing a tax rate will increase revenue. And the other element, as you just pointed out with emergency spending, is, yeah, sure, we need to provide for emergencies when we cap spending growth, which we desperately need to do. But we need to carefully define exactly what we mean by an emergency and build in things like supermajorities to do what some people would call extraordinary spending, and others would not agree that there's anything extraordinary about it. So the cap on spending growth that we desperately need is not just hey, let's limit spending growth to 0% or 1% or 2%. We need to build in provisions to deal with emergencies, and we need to look at tax increases. Sadly, both of us are political conservatives, and we don't talk about tax increases lightly. But we've gotten ourselves in a deep fix here, and so it's like when you run a party and the tab comes due, you got to figure out some way to pick up that tab.
Well, what strikes me at this point in time is that you and I are the only ones talking about the debt crisis. There's almost no discussion of the debt crisis at the federal level. The electoral debates, the candidates, they basically don't even talk about it. They've thrown in the towel, and it's almost like, well, let's just continue muddling along until we hit the fiscal cliff. So somehow you and I need to get our discussion of the debt crisis out there in the public domain, because politicians, they don't even want to touch discussions of debt and cuts in spending and so forth. So
tax increases, all the things that they don't want to talk about. Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons that we started the Institute for Objective Policy Assessment, is to deal with that existential threat that George Will aptly described as a sleepwalk into a financial crisis. Almost no one is aware of it, and 99% of the people that are aware of it don't want to talk about it, because their political opponent will use any specificity in terms of spending cuts against them. It's very difficult to cut spending, but we've gotten ourselves in a situation where there will be spending cuts. What we're doing is unsustainable. The only question is whether we're ready to do them in a careful way that doesn't compromise our most important programs and our national defense. And well, we desperately need a cap on spending growth to have any hope of not going over the fiscal cliff. But I fear that the better option is to be ready to go over it because, well, we're likely to. And with that, I think we'll leave it till next week. Of course, the people viewing this, by the time they discover us, we may have piled up several of these, and so they can watch the next one here if they so choose. See you next week, Barry.
Okay.